and 10 wide, surrounded by an amphitheater of hills sloping to flat, and in many places marshy, shores. On the wide waters the fleet of Antony lay moored, line behind line, a forest of masts and yards. In the narrows of the entrance some of his largest ships were anchored. Many of the ships of Phoenicia and Egypt displayed an Eastern profusion of color in their painted upper works, their gilded bows, and their bright flags and streamers. Near the southern shore lay the state galley of Cleopatra, a floating palace with its silken sails, guided bulwarks, and oars bound and plated with silver. A line of earthworks and forts across the neck of the northern point, garrisoned by the best of Antony's Roman veterans, defended one side of the narrows. The other side was a low-lying, triangular stretch of land, dry, sandy ground. The Greeks knew it as the Acqui, just as the Italian soldiers called it the Punta, both words having the same meaning, the point. At its northern extremity, on a rocky platform, there rose a temple of Apollo, known as Actium, the sanctuary of the point, a place of pilgrimage for the fisher and sailor folk of the neighborhood. Its name, Latinized into Actium, became famous as that of the naval battle. On the level ground of the temple was the camp of the army of Antony and Cleopatra, a city of tents and reed-built huts, within its midst the gay pavilions of the court. It was a mixed gathering of many nations, Roman legions commanded by the veterans of the wars of Caesar, Egyptian battalions in the quaint war dress we see on the painted walls of the tombs of the Nile, and the semi-barbarous levies of the tributary kings of Eastern Asia. There was widespread dissension and mutual suspicion among the allies. Not a few of the Romans were chafing at their leader's subservience to a barbarian queen. Many of the eastern kinglets were considering whether they could not make a better bargain with Octavian. The cavalry of both armies skirmished among the hills on the land side of the Gulf, and prisoners made by Octavian's troops readily took service with them. Then one of the Asiatic kings, instead of fighting, joined the hostile cavalry with his barbaric horsemen, and night after night Roman deserters stole into the camp of Octavian on the northern height. An attempt led by Antony in person against the Roman entrenchments was beaten off. A detachment of the fleet tried to elude the vigilance of Agrippa and slip out to the sea, but had to retire before superior numbers. Then both parties watched each other, while at the headquarters of Antony councils of war were held to debate upon a plan of campaign. The situation was becoming difficult, for Octavian contented himself with holding his fortified camp with his infantry, drawing his supplies freely from oversea, while his cavalry prevented anything reaching Antony's lines from the land side, and Agrippa's fleet, blockading the Gulf and sweeping the sea, made it impossible to bring corn from Egypt. Provisions were running short, and sickness was rife. A move of some kind must be made. The veteran Canidius, who commanded the army under Antony, had, like most of the Romans, little faith in the efficiency of the fleet. He proposed to Antony that it should be abandoned, and that the army should march eastward into Macedonia, and, with an unexhausted country to supply it, await the pursuit of 10 legions of Octavian in a favorable position. But Antony, influenced by Cleopatra, refused to desert the fleet, which was the one possible hope of reaching Egypt again, and rejecting an attack on Roman entrenchments as a hopeless enterprise, he decided at last that all the treasure of court and army should be embarked on the ships, and an effort made to break through the blockading squadrons. While the preparations were being made, the Romans renewed their entreaties that their leader would rather stake his fortunes on a battle on land. One day a veteran centurion of his guard, who bore the honorable scars of many campaigns, addressed him with tears in his eyes, said to Antony, "Imperator, why distrust these wounds, this sword? Why put your hopes on wretched legs of wood? Let Phoenicians and Egyptians fight on the sea, but let us have land on which we know how to conquer or die." It is the appeal that Shakespeare puts into the mouth of one of Antony's soldiers. "O noble emperor, do not fight by sea. Trust not to rotten planks. Do you misdoubt this sword and these my wounds? Let the Egyptians and the Phoenicians go a-ducking. We have used to conquer standing on the earth and fighting foot to foot." The sight of the Egypto-Roman fleet crowding down to the narrows with their sails bent on their yards showed that they meant to risk putting to sea, and Octavian embarked on Agrippa's fleet, with picked reinforcements from the legions. For 4 days the wind blew strongly from the southwest, and the blockaded fleet waited for better weather. On the 5th day the wind had fallen, the sea was smooth, and the sun shone brightly. The floating castles of Antony's van division worked out of the straits, and after them in long procession came the rest of the Roman, Phoenician, and Egyptian galleys. From the hills to the northward of the straits, from the low-lying headland of Actium to the south, 2 armies, each of 100,000 men, watched the spectacle, and waited anxiously for the sight of the coming battle. The western fleet had steered to a position off the entrance formed in 2 divisions, the one led by Agrippa, the other by Octavian. Agrippa, whose experience and record of naval victory gave him the executive command, had no intention of risking his small ships in the Narrows, where they would have been opposed by an equal number of heavier ships, more numerously manned, and would lose whatever advantage their superior handiness and seaworthiness gave them, through having no room to maneuver. He kept his fleet of 400 triremes sufficiently far from the shore to avoid the shelving shallows that fringe it near the entrance to the strait, and to have ample sea room. For some time the fleets remained in presence of each other, both hesitating to begin the attack. Antony knew that his slower and heavier ships would have the best chance acting inshore and on the defensive, and Agrippa was, on the other hand, anxious not to engage until he could lure them out seaward, where his light craft would have all the gain of rapid maneuvering. It was not till near noon that at last the western fleet closed with the allies. The ships that first encountered were nearly all Roman vessels, for the Egyptian and Asiatic squadrons were not in the front line of Antony's fleet, and the brunt of the attack fell upon the sluggish giants which had been so elaborately fortified, with booms in the water and towers and breastworks on their decks. As the attacking ships came into range, arrows, javelins, and stones flew hurtling through the air from the line of floating castles, missiles that did not, however, inflict much loss, for the men on the decks of the attacking fleet crouched behind bulwarks or covered themselves with their oblong shields, and their bowmen made some show of reply to the heavier discharge of engines of war on Antony's ships and to the more rapid shooting of the Asiatic archers. The days were still far off when sea fights would be decided by fire in the sense of the discharge of projectiles. Could the tall ships have rammed the smaller and lower galleys of Octavian and Agrippa, they would certainly have sent them to the bottom, a sunken ship for each blow of the brazen beak. But attempts at ramming were soon found by Antony's captains to be useless and dangerous. It was not merely that their lighter and nimbler opponents easily avoided the onset. The well-trained crews evaded every attempt to run them down or grapple them, chose their own distance as they hovered round their huge adversaries, and presently, as they gained confidence from impunity, began successfully to practice the maneuver of eluding the ram, and using their own bows, not for a blow against the hull of the heavier ship, but to sweep away and shatter her long oars, which were too heavy to be saved by drawing them in or unshipping them. Successful attack on the oars was equivalent to disabling an adversary's engines in a modern sea fight, and when a ship was thus crippled, her opponents could choose their time to concentrate several of their ships for a joint attempt to take her by boarding. The unwieldy ships of Antony's first line, with their half-trained and untrained crews, must have formed a straggling, irregular line with large intervals as they stood out to sea, and it was this that gave Octavian's fleet the opportunity for the worrying tactics they adopted. Had the Egyptian and Phoenician ships come to the support of the leading line, their more sailor-like crews might have helped to turn the scale against Octavian. But while the fight was yet undecided, and before the Egyptian squadron had taken any part in it, a breeze sprung up from the land, blowing from the northeast. Then, to the dismay of Antony's veterans, who watched the battle from the headland of Actium, it was seen that the Egyptians were unfurling their sails from the long yards. The signal had been given from Cleopatra's stately vessel, which as battle began had rowed out to a position in the midst of the Egyptian squadron, and now shook out her purple sails to the breeze, silken fabrics of fiery red, that seemed at first glance like a battle signal. But in battle sails were never used, and ships trusted entirely to the oar, so to set the sails meant plainly that the fight was to be abandoned. Dropping her silver-tipped oars, helped now with the land breeze that swelled her sails, Cleopatra's galley passed astern of the fighting line on its extreme right.